Stop recording now.
Okay, it's I've got 5:01, and Ken, we're going to go ahead and get started. I looked at the participants category. It looks like we've got about 30 participants on now. We don't want to take any more than Ms. Cook's time that she's going to allow us, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to say good afternoon to all of our alumni, friends, and supporters, especially our chapter presidents and all the members of the chapters throughout the state and throughout the country if you're on this webinar. If you recall, at our last legislative conference that was held virtually back in February, one of the things that that we said we would do, we would try to make sure that we answered some of the pertinent questions that came up during that session. So one of the main questions that came up was the question of the funding of the units within the university system of Georgia, with particular emphasis on the 3 HBCUs, Albany State, Savannah State, and Fort Valley State. So we have the resident expert with us today who's going to give us a presentation on how that funding takes place, where it emanates from, right down to the end user, and that is our 3 HBCUs. But before we get started, I'm going to ask Clyde Newton, the current Savannah State University National Alumni President, if he's on the call. Would he invoke the Lord's presence on this meeting? Clyde, if you're on the call, would you give us a brief invocation, please?
He's not on the call.
If he's not on the call, I'll do it myself. Let us pray. Our God and our Father, we come before you at this time, thanking you for the many blessings that you bestowed upon us. Father, we thank you for the blessings of life, the blessings of liberty, and the blessings of health. And Father, most of all, we thank you for your son, Jesus, who came that we might have life and that we might have life more abundantly. Father, we ask that you would be with us today. We trust that everything we say and do here will be pleasing in thy sight. We ask your continued presence and guidance on the presidents of these 3 universities, on the alumni of these 3 universities, and above all, Father, the students of these 3 universities. We ask you to continue to grant them wisdom, grant them guidance, and grant them your directions as we try to move these universities to even higher heights. And Father, if you would do this, we'd be so kind to give you all the praise, the honor, and the glory for which you so richly deserve. For it is in the name of Jesus Christ, the risen Savior, we ask these blessings. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay, at this particular time, as I indicated earlier, one of the questions that came up during the virtual session in February was how the funding got from the legislature down to the university. So we have Ms. Cook here. She is the Executive Vice Chancellor for Strategy and Fiscal Affairs at the board's office. And she did this presentation in the 2020 conference in person. Did an excellent job and answered all the questions that we asked of her in terms of how the funding gets to our universities. But there may have been some people who were not a part of that conference, and there may have been some people who were part of the conference, but for whatever reason missed that session. So she has graciously agreed to come back and do that presentation again for us, and tweaking it wherever it's appropriate. So Tracey, at this particular time, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and you can come to us as you see fit. And Ken, as we did in our virtual conference, what we asked the alumni to do is write your questions in the Q&A section of at the bottom of your screen. Write those questions that you might have for Ms. Cook in the Q&A category at the bottom of your screen. And once the presentation has ended, we will have Ken to read the questions, and we'll have Ms. Cook try to answer those questions. So at this time, I give you Ms. Tracey Cook, the Vice Chancellor, Executive Vice Chancellor for Strategy and Fiscal Affairs at the board's office. Ms. Cook.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I enjoyed it last year. So I told them I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it this year, as long as I don't get any hard questions.
Well, we can't promise that.
If too many hard questions, I'm not coming back next year. But thank you for having me. What I want to do, I'm gonna give me a second, my camera, and I'm just gonna try to get myself acclimated a little bit. What I want to do is there's an agenda. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. There's a couple things I'd like to accomplish. I think in order to talk about how we get funded as a university system, being a state agency, we have to talk about the budget for the state of Georgia in the context. Then we'll move on to talk about the university system. We'll talk some about the funding formula. We are governed by a funding formula and how that works and how those dollars get to our institutions. I would like to spend a little bit of time on enrollment trends, just big picture enrollment trends, and then end with some trends that we see at our 3 HBCUs. So if a question comes out, I guess we're going to do questions at the end.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's how we'll work that. All right, what's happening here? This is not the way this slide is supposed to look. This is most unusual, because it doesn't look like this on my screen.
Uh-oh.
There we go. All right. So this is the state of Georgia. This is the state of Georgia generates about $27.5 billion in a year. This is, you know, their main source of revenues are obviously income taxes that they collect from all of us, corporate taxes, sales and use tax. Those are the main categories that make up the revenue streams into the state. So the better they do, the better we do as individuals in our income levels, corporations do, the more revenue that the state earns, the more that they are able to distribute to the agencies to which they support. So this pie chart basically looks at, if you took the $27+ billion of the state, how do they divvy up those funds? And what you can see, I mean, the largest pieces are health and safety make up a good chunk, but the main piece is education. 53% of the state of Georgia's budget goes to education in some form or fashion. You can see in that blue section of the pie chart that about almost close to 40% of that goes to K through 12. So they support the K through 12 system, but then another 9.3% comes directly to the university system of Georgia. So one thing, when I love this chart, and this is not the same for all states. Different states do different things, but the one thing about Georgia is there is a strong commitment to education, and even more specifically, higher education. So that 9.3 billion or so, actually it's 8.9 now, I'm sorry, I got to get my charts in order, translates into about $2.3 billion for the university system of Georgia. So this next slide, it's a historical perspective. It's about 25 years worth of data. And what it's doing, the bar charts are actually the amount of state funds received from the state year over year. The green line shows our enrollment. So our enrollment is currently about 341,000 students. And so you can see over time, our enrollment has increased. We've had a small dip, but overall we've been on a pretty much a steady increase, at least for this chart since 1996. A couple things I do want to point out. The state, we are funded through a formula. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. So that's how we get our money from the state. And so the main input to that formula is enrollment. And so what you would expect to see is, as our enrollment increases, so too would the dollars that come in from the state. And for the most part, that is what you see. There were a couple of periods, I don't know if some of you remember, early 2000, we hit a small recession. 2009, 10, 11, we hit the Great Recession. And then most recently, we had the pandemic. And so what those red lines attempt to do is it shows you those disruptions to the state. They were national disruptions, not just to Georgia, but nationally. They impact our state revenues, right? And so we talked about, if one of the main inputs to the state's revenue stream is income tax, right? As people are laid off, as people are losing their jobs during the recession, those have very direct implications for the revenues of the state. And so as the state's revenues declined during those time periods, so did the amount of funds that they were able to provide to state agencies. And so we saw again in the early 2000, late 2000, and then most recently the year of the pandemic, we did see a decline in funding and funding support from the state of Georgia. I always put it this way: they can only give what they have, right? They can't shell out more than they earn. It's painful to not just the USG, but to all the state agencies, but it's something that we have to live with. And so this chart basically shows the other thing I wanted to point out, that during recessions, generally speaking, and I think the green line shows this, students or people go back to school. When when they've lost their jobs, they come back to retool, to maybe take a different path. And so we as a university system actually see enrollment increases during times of recessions, which actually puts more pressure on the whole budget process for the University System of Georgia. But we have other levers, I'll talk about those in a second, that we use to try to balance our budget. So this is, just wanted to show you the historical picture of funding from the state. So this slide, I'm shifting from the state, right, to just specifically the University System of Georgia. So what this slide does is it shows our fiscal year 21, that's the fiscal year that we're in. It began last July. This is our budget for the year. So our fiscal year goes from July 1 to June 30. Again, you can see the state appropriations, $2.3 billion. That's what we just talked about on the other slide, makes up about a quarter, 25% of the total budget of the university system. Tuition and the special institutional fee, which is much like tuition, makes up another, I'm going to round up, another 25%. So half of our budget really comes from state appropriations and tuition. And I want to say that those three buckets of money really are the main sources of revenue that support the instruction or education mission of the university system. So they do all things that, if you can imagine the classroom experience, they cover the faculty, they cover all those student supports, library services, admissions office, registrar, all of those things that help get our students admitted and keep them retained through graduation. So academic support, all of that is covered with those funds. You can also see that we call sponsored funds, also make up another significant portion of the university system budget. 28% of the budget, or $2.6 billion, comes from sponsored funds. Those are mainly funds that we receive from the federal government. So about $500 million or so of that is the Pell. We also, sponsored includes not just research dollars, but also dollars that we get in the form of financial aid. We do get about $500 million in aid across all of our institutions. And then, you know, many of our institutions have receive research dollars or other dollars from the federal government, but I would say the majority of those funds are concentrated at what we call our R1s, or our research institutions like UGA, Georgia Tech, and Augusta University and Georgia State University. They're research institutions, that's part of their mission, and so you do see a large portion of those dollars being generated at those schools. Another category I'll mention is auxiliary services. It's another 11% of our budget. And those are all things that really support the student experience on our campuses. So if you can imagine, our housing and dining operations, athletics, our bookstores, all of that generates another $1 billion across all of our institutions. So again, university systems budget, 9.38 or 9.4 billion rounded. And those are the major revenue categories. So want to shift and talk about, I'm going to go back for a second. So we talk about this $2.3 billion, that's technology. Okay, I guess I can't. We talk about this $2.3 billion and how do we get that money from the state, right? That is what they provide. But I really want to talk about how we get it. And at 90% of those dollars come to us through what we call the funding formula. It's actually called, it has a name, the funding formula of excellence. And so what is the formula? The formula is really a method for approaching funds that link the inputs to the dollars, right? tell me, you know, and so you'll see our inputs, our enrollment, and we talked about that earlier, and then how much money is really needed to cover those costs. So our funding formula was imagined back in the early 80s. So it's pretty dated, right? It was imagined in the early 80s that the then governor created a study committee, and they looked at formula funding. I'm sure this was happening probably in other states. This was really a partnership between the Board of Regents, the General Assembly, the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. When I went back to I think there was even some business leaders and business input into developing this formula. And so the formula was created in 1992 and became effective in 1984. And so what our formula attempts to do is calculate lump sum for the university system of Georgia as a whole. How many dollars, or what is the amount of funding that's needed to educate the students, right? So how much is needed based on the number of students that we're servicing across all of our institutions to support all of those things that I just talked about, the faculty, the support services, all of those things that help make our students successful. And so, the main, and we'll talk about the main inputs in a second, but in order to do that, and then it says, it spits out a number. So it says, I'm going to make this up. If you have 1,000 students, then you should spend, I'm really making this up, $50,000 on those students, right? And so the formula was also designed as an ask formula. So we can then ask, in my example, we would go to the General Assembly, we would make the ask for the $50,000 to support our students across the campuses. If the General Assembly, like I said, you saw in the trend data that for the most part, they have honored this formula over the years. It has only been during times of recession and significant financial hardship of the state that they have not been able to honor the formula, but otherwise they really have committed to it. And so those funds then come to the board. We allocate those funds to our institutions. And then I do want to point out that when the formula was originally contemplated, the thought was for every dollar that's needed, the state would provide 75 cents and tuition would make up 25%. And so that's kind of the difference. You know, in a private institutions, 100%, right, comes from tuition. Although they generally have endowments and things of that nature, but if just for comparative purposes, where for a public higher education does receive state support. In our case, it was designed that 75% of that support would come from the state, 25% from tuition. Again, we talked about the recessions. We talked about those difficult periods of time where the state had to cut our budget and was not able to fund the level required. And so what happened is we saw a shift in what the state could support and more being supported by way of tuition and fees. And so now, as opposed to being a 75-25, we're about 50-50 to what the state provides versus what tuition covers, which is still, if you compared us across many other states across the nation who also face similar challenges during those periods, we are still doing very well as a state. And so this chart shows just what I was talking about, the state's share. So if you can imagine what these percentages represent is what percentage is the state providing by way of revenue in support of the formula. I won't spend a lot of time. It's just really in a graphical way recapturing what I just talked about. If I were to pull this all the way back to 1984, it would have said 75% all the way across the top. But again, you can see during those periods of time where we had the recession, the Great Recession, and the pandemic, you see these small dips in the state's share of funding. All right, so the formula, we keep talking about this formula, right? What are the main inputs in the formula? Again, it is an enrollment-driven formula. That is the main input. It is not actually enrollment or head count, but what we use is credit hour production. So every credit hour that a student takes gets counted in the formula. And so we run this, you know, if our credit hours increase year over year, we would anticipate growth, right? New money from the state. If our credit hours were ever to decrease year over year, the state would pull back money. And so it is, the formula is based on a 2-year lag. So in this example, the funding that we received in the current fiscal year for fiscal year 21 is actually based on fiscal year 19 academic enrollment data. And the reason is, you know, again, when the formula was designed, it wanted to have actual, you know, not guesstimates or estimates. It wanted to use actual enrollment information. So if you can imagine, fiscal year 19 is the last academic year was completed at the time to make the ask in order to be funded for fiscal year 21. So if you can imagine, we just went through the cycle for fiscal year 22, and we used the academic year 20, the change year over year to make that ask. I want to point out a couple things before I move away. Just going back to the formula, you know, there are pros and cons to the formula, right? I like the formula. I like the fact that we have one. Sometimes I'm on calls with my peers at other institutions that don't. It is very random how they're funded at any time. The legislator may or may not provide funding. They may pull funding. The one thing I do enjoy about this formula, and while it is not in code, it's not a legislative mandate. Again, it was developed collectively, and it has been honored since its inception, except for those periods of time that I've talked about. And so the thing that I think it does well is that it keeps up with enrollment growth. It's also predictable, right? We know we have this formula. We know if we see our credit hours go up, we can expect to get money. We know if we see our credit hours go down, we can expect to lose money. And it really simplifies the budget process as we work with our funding partners. Again, I think, like I said, some other states who don't have really systematic ways of asking for money, it becomes a little random. And in times of crisis, it's just, you know, the funding is not funded, and it's very disruptive to the university system. Some of the cons, you know, it is just enrollment driven. People always ask, are we ever going to move to a performance-based formula? This was something that was contemplated several years ago, but at the end, it was put on pause, and we're still working through this formula. So. That's one, you know, and you can say some of the factors are outdated, right? If you think about, you know, do we service students exactly the same way we used to service them? Is it 40 years? I don't know if my math is right. Yeah, I think it is close to 40 years ago. And the answer is probably no. But again, I do think the pros of having it and the predictability of it, and I think it still has relevance, definitely outweighs any of the cons. And so the next, let me skip to the next slide here. So this is just really informational. It just shows you, again, when I talk about credit hour production, this last year, we had 8.6 credit hours across all institutions, across all of our students. So at that time, back in fall of 2019, we had 330, this is very sensitive, 333,000 students, 8.6 credit hours. So again, it's that delta in the credit hours that drive the formula. But again, enrollment, credit hours is really a proxy for enrollment or vice versa. The other thing I want to mention about credit hours, because again, this is the singular most important input to this formula, is not all credit hours are equal. And so I think this is important because if you have two institutions, and let's say campus, we haven't got into maintenance and operation yet, but let's just say the size of the campus is identical square footage, each has 1,000 students. But if one school is teaching engineering, right, they're teaching courses that fall into a higher value group, right, as opposed to maybe English, right? Not as technical, not as lab intensive or equipment intensive. The formula it does value these things differently. It also looks at lower level courses, all the way up to graduate level courses, right? And makes a distinction there in the amount funded. So you could have two institutions that have exactly the same number of students, but their funding per student could be very different. And it's all about the composition. What are they teaching? What levels are they teaching? Are they associate dominant? Are they bachelor dominant? Are they graduate dominant? So all of that matters. And sometimes I think that gets lost in the conversation. Quickly hit 2 and 3, which are the last two inputs. Again, the biggest one is our credit hours, but maintenance and operation, the formula also looks at square footage, so buildings across campuses, and it understands that if I have 1 student or if I have 10 students in a classroom, it's going to cost me the same amount to heat and cool it and all of that. And so what it does is it has a factor in there that says, tell us how much square footage that you've grown, right? If you're building new, if you're adding on, if you're demolishing, that matters. And so the formula takes that into account year over year and also provides funding for that. And then lastly, the health insurance, it does try to keep pace with changes in health insurance that our employees face by way of premiums. And so we make for the institution, for the state share, we make an ask to provide that as well. And so those are the three inputs to the formula. So shifting gears a little bit, this is the cycle of how it all works. So usually in the June, July timeframe, right, we begin gathering all that information that we need. So we have an Office of Research and Policy Analysis here at the system office. It gathers all the credit hour information across our institutions. And we put that together and we do that year over year comparison. We put that data in the formula. We gather information about new buildings, square footage, demolitions across our campuses. We put that in, and we work with our folks in Office of Human Resources here at the system office to learn more about what's going to happen to healthcare and health insurance costs in the future. And so once we have all that information, we put that in the formula, we run the formula. And usually in the August and or September meeting, it does go back and forth. We make the formal ask to the board and we say, you know, the formula basically says, based on our growth, we should receive X number of new dollars from the state. And so once the board approves that, we then submit that to the Office of Planning and Budget. Those budgets are due, that information is due to the OPB, or Office of Planning and Budget, every September. So every September, every agency, not just the University System of Georgia, but every agency across the system is responsible to submit their budget to them. More often than not, the instructions that we'll get, especially because we you know, coming out of the recession, we never really, I mean, we've stabilized as a state. I think we've done pretty well, but basically most agencies, not institutions, most other agencies have been asked to keep their budgets flat or very minimal changes that they're able to request. Because we are funded through a formula, K through 12 is also funded through the formula. The state has permitted us, even in times where there's been a lot of pressure on the state, to at least ask to make the ask. And so every September we have been permitted to make the ask through the formula to the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. And so what happens between the months of September and January, that's when the Governor's Office is, you know, asking questions of the state agencies. We in turn ask questions of our institutions to really understand what are the needs, priorities of the system. They ask for all of the data that supports our formula. And then January is when the governor makes his big announcement, and that's when he releases his recommendation for the state of Georgia. And so we always quickly go to our pages and see, does our request mirror the governor's recommendation? Fiscal year 22, I know we're in 21, right? Those funds were secured last year. We're living that budget, but we literally just finished the legislative cycle for fiscal year 22. Those dollars will be available to us beginning January 1. It was a really good year. I think the state's economy, in spite of the pandemic, is doing really well. The year-over-year revenues, I had that chart somewhere, are up, I want to say close to 8% if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me though, because I don't have the paper in front of me. But as a state, the revenue collections are doing well. And so that did show up in our fiscal year 22 budget. And so generally, but just back to the cycle. So the January, March timeframe, it's moving through the House, through the Senate, if it needs to go to conference. And generally at the end of March, and literally this year, it was March 31st that the General Assembly passed the final budget again this March for the upcoming year. And so the next chart, just quickly, I want to take it. A lot of this is very similar, same information, but this is, it picks it up in May or in April, because what happens then is our board, in essence, votes on allocations, tuition and fees, and that's what they did at our April board meeting. In May, all of our institutions right now are working to develop their budgets. And we'll get that into us by, I think it's the first week in May. We'll take that to the board for approval. We'll submit it to OPB. And then on July 1, we will begin our new fiscal year with our FY22 funding. One thing I didn't talk about is the allocation. So I mentioned that the formula is an ask formula, right? So unlike some other states, our legislative body doesn't dictate how each institution gets its money. We make the ask in lump sum, and then our board allocates those funds to each institution. The strategy that we use is heavily weighed, but not entirely weighed, because there are other factors, but it's heavily weighed in how you earn it, you receive it, how you lose it is how you lose it. Meaning if you're a growing institution and you're earning money, we try to honor that. If you're a shrinking institution, if your enrollment is declining, we recognize that you need less faculty, less staff, etc. I will say, you know, our strategy has been mixed in years. We do on a case-by-case basis work with our institutions that are declining in enrollment. We want to make certain that they have adequate resources to continue to function. We do mitigate, you know, some of the losses year over year to ensure that they have the funding needed to cover faculty and other important costs for education. So it's not a dollar for dollar allocation. There are other things that are considered. If there are strategic priorities or initiatives that need to be addressed, we also work that through the allocation process. But for the most part, the thinking is, you know, if you're growing, you're an earner. If you're shrinking, you probably need to reset and readjust accordingly. All right, if I can shift to enrollment, just to talk about enrollment, because enrollment is changing. The enrollment landscape is changing. This is just a historical picture. We talked about this on a previous slide. We have grown, right? We have grown, and this is a 15-year look back. Modest growth, you can see over the last 7 years. Once we came out of the recession in the 2011, 2012 timeframe, you can see our enrollment did drop. That's not atypical because we saw such a surge in enrollment during the recession. So as those folks went back to work, we saw a drop, but since that time, we have seen a steady, modest incline in enrollment growth year over year. This is the system, this is the picture, and this is what it looks like if you add all 26 institutions together for the university system at large. I do want to say that that picture is not the same across every institution. We do have institutions that are growing, and we also have institutions that are experiencing some enrollment challenges. So there are two things on our minds, two things that we pay attention to as we think about enrollment. And so one is Georgia population, right? And so this chart specifically looks at it and it projects what it thinks is going to happen to the population for folks that are age 15 to 26 in the different regions. If I were to pull this chart by county, it's more granular. So even in the light blue area, you'll see some beige and some light blue and some beige, etc. So, but this is kind of, if you kind of merge it all together, what it kind of looks like for the state. And so students, people age 15 to 24 is obviously our target population. And so we pay attention to regions that are shrinking. And so as you can see, the beige is projecting decrease, either flat growth or really a shrinkage in those areas. The lighter blue is very modest growth. And again, if I showed you by county, you would see pockets of beige, pockets of blue. And really the growth, the majority of the growth in this state is projected for the next 10 years to happen in the north. And so we pay attention to that, right? Because what you see across this diagram is our institutions. We have 26 institutions that really span the entire state. And many of those institutions are in areas where the population, our target population, is shrinking. And so that is something that we have to, in our institutions, have to pay attention to. Another phenomenon that we're seeing is the pipeline of high school graduates is changing. And so studies show, our chancellor always jokes about this, but really what happened, there was a period of time where birth rates just went down, and we can't go back and undo that 18 years ago, right? It is what it is. And so because that happened, we're seeing what's projected is that we're going to see a decline in high school graduates, the high school pipeline, starting somewhere in 2026. And it's really going to take a pretty sharp dip, just surely because of decline in birth rates 18 years back. And so that is something that we're paying attention to, that we recognize is coming. For the next several years, we do expect modest growth in the number of high school graduates, but our institutions have to pay attention and be prepared for that as well. And so I say all that because it's important that we pay attention to enrollment. We have many strategies in place. I don't know if some of you have heard, we have an initiative called No More, Borrow Less across our institutions. And I'm sorry, not No More, Borrow Less. I'm sorry, the momentum year, and I'm going to get to No More, Borrow Less, but the momentum year is a big one. And what that really tries to do is look at, you know, what are students doing their first year? And we pulled some data, and it looks like studies show that students who take a full load and really tackle English and math in their first year are more successful to continue. And so many of our institutions have really embraced those concepts and are working with our students to really help to retain those students. Because retention is key, right? I mean, the days of bringing them in one year and letting them go, we have to just be more deliberate and more strategic about keeping students and getting them all the way to the finish line, because the ultimate goal is to have that degree. We know, and I don't have this chart, but you know, just the earning potential, when you look at, there's a chart I can imagine, I don't have it included, but the earning potential is going from someone without a high school degree, someone with a high school degree, someone with an associate degree, with a bachelor's and graduate, all the way up. Just the earnings potential just increases at every layer. And so we want to make certain that we graduate students. It's a benefit to them, it's a benefit to families, and if I tie it all the way back, it's a benefit to the state, right? Because they're going to pay income taxes, which benefit the state. So it's something that we are a part of, that we aspire to do, and that we are paying a lot more attention to. Just a couple other enrollment strategies I'll mention. We do have what we call a No More, Borrow Less initiative that was kicked off. And the goal of that is, you know, in the past, we had always said, you know, here's what you're able to borrow, you know, go forth. But now it is really sitting down with our students, educating them more about financial responsibility. What does this mean when you borrow this money? And really helping them to borrow what you need. You don't have to borrow everything, borrow what you need. And so we're hoping to see some results of that in the next couple of years, to see if we've made a dent in the borrowing levels of our students. We're monitoring our enrollment. A lot of our institutions are paying attention to applicants, really pushing to get those completed. Contacting students more, customer service has to be a focus. And so lots of things going on our campuses to really get at maintaining and improving enrollment. So with that, this is my final shift. I think this was number 5 on the agenda. I do just want to talk briefly about the HBCUs. We have 3, obviously, y'all know this: Albany, Fort Valley, Savannah. I did my best to match the colors. I'm sure I got it wrong. But the blue line is Albany, yellow Fort Valley, orange line is Savannah State University. I just wanted to show you some enrollment trends over time. Albany looks very different. If you remember, they back in, can't remember, and I want to say that the data for Albany includes the previous Darton State College. It's a combined line, but those enrollments were declining at each institution even before consolidation. And what we're so happy to see is, you know, while we were still declining, the decline became less steep. And in fall 22, we started to see Albany turn the corner, and they actually had an enrollment increase. So very happy and proud of them. Savannah has been stable, but on a slight decline. And so that's another institution, you know, just paying attention to enrollment strategies, trying to do more by way of technology. And Fort Valley has been relatively stable, and they too had a small uptick this past fiscal year in students. So just, again, paying attention to enrollment at all of our institutions. Wanted to share that. A couple other things I wanted to show: 1-year retention rate at our HBCUs. And so what this means is students who start and come back the next year, right? Again, you can see, so at Albany, roughly 75%, I'm sorry, Fort Valley, 75% of the students are retained. And I want to say that I had another chart, because this is the institution level. But I think as important is, you know, sometimes our students transfer out and they go to other schools. And so we do track that as well. And there's about a 5 to 7% bump, if you will, that a student who may have started at Fort Valley was still retained at one of our other institutions somewhere else. And that bump was consistent, that's 5 to 7% range across all 3 institutions. Again, you can see just the improvements that are happening across Savannah and Albany State University. Lastly, I'll talk about the 6-year graduation rates of our institutions. And so these are the percentage of students that are graduating in 6 years. Again, much improvement at Fort Valley and Albany. Savannah has been stable on a slight decline. And so, you know, having this data helps the institution position themselves to figure out, you know, what are the drivers here? Is it money? What is it? And so that's why it's really important for one of the other strategies I didn't talk about was just gap funding for students, right? Having dollars available through foundation or private giving that can help sometimes close that gap for students. And then lastly, degrees awarded. And so across, I didn't say this, but across the 3 institutions, we are educating over 12,000 students at our historically Black colleges, which is something to be very proud of. And this I love, we're graduating over 2,300. So in fiscal year 2020, we graduated over 2,300 students, which I think makes a difference for, again, the individual, the family, and the state. So wanted to end on that note. I think the trend at Albany, again, followed the enrollment trend, but again, you can see turn the corner and starting to see improvement in the number of graduates. So with that, I will stop. I'll say thank you again for your time. And that's a lot of information. I know you're online. Hopefully you had a snack, maybe even a drink, a glass of wine, but hopefully it was helpful. And I'll pause for questions.
Thank you, Tracy, for an outstanding presentation. A lot of the information we've heard before, but it's always good to have this information reiterated, because a lot of times we miss certain points, but you have really captured the essence of I think what our alumni are interested in terms of the formula by which we get our funding at these 3 institutions. I don't think I can emphasize too much the importance of 3 areas here, which you mentioned, and whenever the chancellor talks, he always talks about these 3 key points. That's enrollment, retention, and graduation. At one time in our history, the focus was primarily on enrollment. We got our money based on head count.
Yep.
That over a number of years presented problems, as we saw, so they went to some other areas. So we're now looking at not only enrollment by which we get our dollars, but we also have to focus on retention, retaining those students after the first year, not letting them drop out. And the ultimate goal is get them to the target area of graduation, whether that's in 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years. So that's one thing that we have to be particularly interested in. And I know our administrators and our presidents, their focus is on those 3 key areas of those universities. So again, thank you, Tracey, for an outstanding presentation. And at this particular time, we will open it up for questions and answers. And Ken, if you would read the questions, and hopefully Tracey can provide some input, some answers to those questions. Ken?
Yes, okay, certainly, thank you. We have, I think, 10, 11 questions now. I'll start with the first one. What percentage of sponsored funding for HBCUs is from financial aid versus other sources, such as research, etc.?
That I'd have to calculate that. I don't know. I will say Fort Valley is a land grant institution, obviously, so they probably of the 3 have the highest federal dollars outside of the financial aid, but I'd have to put together a quick chart. I just don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question is, how is equity built into the funding formula?
So equity, I'll answer it this way. And if I don't answer your question, whoever asked it, just chime in. When you say equity, for me, the notion is that the formula is supported by a mechanism that makes sense, right? And so we talked about, you know, if you're teaching lower level courses, higher level courses, graduate courses, and so you're going to get, for the most part, what you earned through the formula. So it is very equitable how the board allocates the fund. Like I said, we do, on a case-by-case basis, do our very best to help institutions that potentially are facing enrollment loss. We try to mitigate those losses. One thing I didn't talk about that we do as a part of our cycle is every year we have the chancellor and his leadership teams brings in the presidents and their leadership team to have a conversation. And we spend an hour talking about enrollment, right? What's happening, what they're seeing, what are some of their pressure points, concerns. And so we try to factor that into as we're allocating the funds across our institutions, listening to what they're saying and trying to address some of those issues. So I think it's equitable in that we attempt to follow the formula, right? And I think the formula itself is designed to fund at the appropriate level. But I think listening to our presidents, understanding the needs and making some decisions on how to keep our institutions healthy provides equity, if that makes any sense.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question is, as it pertains to the funding formula, what is the variation of credit hour production between the different tiers of universities throughout the university system versus the HBCUs, if any?
So I'll say this, I'll talk about it in sectors as opposed to HBCUs, and then among the HBCUs there's a difference because Albany, when it was merged with the former Darton, brought on the access mission, right? When I say access mission, hi Oscar, how are you? Sorry, brought on the access mission, so they offer more associate degrees than Fort Valley and Savannah State. I don't think Fort Valley offers any, and Savannah State very, very few. So it's really, you know, our research institutions that I talked about, you know, have much more graduate and doctoral programs than our state universities, right? All of our 3 HBCUs are state universities. Our state universities are really bachelor dominant and graduate. And then our state colleges, which used to be more of our 2-year colleges, are mostly associate dominant and offer some sprinkling of bachelor's degrees. So it's really in your sector that drives kind of your offerings and your mission. Your mission is tied to your sector. But I would say the one difference even among the 3 HBCUs again is Albany, because they also carry that access mission with them, meaning the associate degree portfolio.
Okay. All right, next question is, what is the timeline for colleges and universities to submit their budget requests for the upcoming fiscal year?
So the budget, I mean, twofold. The budget discussion document, we generally collect, that's due to us in October, but that's not a budget request per se. That's something that drives our conversation. The actual budget, like I said, based on that chart, they're developing those now. So once they were informed of their allocations in April, we know what's happening with tuition and fees. All of our schools right now are deep into developing their budgets for the next fiscal year. So right now that work is underway. Like I said, I think that's due to us the first or second week in May. Then we take that to our board for the university system at large. And then that becomes, once approved, it becomes effective July 1. So that work is happening right now for the next fiscal year.
Thank you. Okay. At the beginning of the presentation, the allocation for research universities was discussed. Is there a reason Fort Valley State University was not lifted up as a research university? Does Fort Valley State University receive the research allocation?
Absolutely. So if we classify, and there's a technical, I'm shifting to the academic side a little bit. There's some technical, we classify our 26 institutions into really 3 main categories. Again, research institutions, and if you look at the mission statements of those institutions, they're different from a state university, which are different from a state college. And so we really have three levels of institutions to serve our students. When we talk about our research universities, it doesn't mean that they are the only universities that provide research, right? That's the label that we put on them. And I really think that's tied to some sort of academic labeling that I don't know enough about. But yes, all of our state universities, to include our 3 HBCUs, all have a research component as well. So they're not excluded from research. They're just not, we refer to them as state universities, research universities, and state colleges.
Okay. Next question. Are special needs and specific historical missions considered in budget formulas?
So yes, again, that's that case-by-case basis. Again, I can talk about Fort Valley. Fort Valley has the land grant mission. And so we do work with that institution to provide funding to support the land grant mission for that institution. That's just one example, but all of it's done, you know, when there are special circumstances on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Next question is, explain no more, borrow or less.
So no more borrow less is an initiative that it's been 2 years now, and it's just the name that we gave to it. And so it really is, if you think about it, is we're saying no, K-N-O-W, right? If you know more, you know, the more you know, the less you may borrow, right? And we only want students, to be very conscious of what's available, but also what's required. And so if you can imagine, let's say you're a student and your bill is $1,000, I'll just make up some numbers, and you're getting, you know, $500 from Pell, you're getting, and so your balance due is $500, but you are able to borrow $3,000, right? We want students to think about that. We want them to know more, and to the extent that it makes sense for them, because what we do now is we show them, if you borrow this $3,000, right, here's the interest, here's what your payments might look like. And so it's really an education strategy It in no way prevents the students from borrowing what they need. We know some students, in addition to the $500 due on their bill, that there may be other responsibilities that they have, and these dollars can be used for that, and we're not stopping them. We want to really educate. It's really an education tool that we think if we can tell students, you know, this is what's available to you, but here's what you really need, right? At least from a student account perspective. I mean, the student has to determine their full need picture, but from a student account perspective, this is what you need. And hey, if you borrow this is what it looks like for your future. So it's really about educating that students. It's about financial literacy. And I really think it's good information for our students to have.
Okay. How do other institutions involve, or do they involve alumni in planning, like site plan or strategic planning, etc.?
That I don't know. I couldn't speak to that intelligent. I would imagine. I know there are alumni associations. I know I think all of our presidents have relationships with the foundation, with the alumni. But how they engage in planning and strategic planning, I don't know. I will say, from a system perspective, I don't know if any of you got a chance to participate, but we as a system, I think we put together our strategic plan. It was right before the pandemic. It's kind of everything hit, and so lots of things got tabled, and focus became on pandemic and how to educate our students safely. But when we put together our strategic plan, we did town hall meetings. I think we hit 5 regions. We came to Savannah, if I'm not mistaken. We had one here in Atlanta. I went to a couple. There was one in Valdosta, and we really sought the community. I can't say we asked alumni specifically, but anybody that was tied to that institution or tied to the community was invited to come and speak. I mean, we got lots of good comments. We had an open forum to where folks could provide comments on our strategic plan. So I can speak to that because I was involved with that. How it works at the institution level, I would imagine it varies, and some involve them and some don't, but that's really at the institution's discretion.
Tracey, let me see if I can help you out there. You did mention the fact that when the systems office was putting together its strategic plan, it did send out calls for people within the communities where those institutions were located at a town hall meeting. I know I attended one at Fort Valley State.
Excellent.
And they gave people in the community, students, alumni, friends, and other supporters of the institution to take part in that Q&A session and provide any suggestion that the board could take back and incorporate into that strategic plan. So the system office was involved to that extent. As far as our 3 HBCUs go, it's the same basic philosophy, same basic principle. Whenever they're putting their strategic plan together, they send out a call to all alumni, to friends in the area, community leaders, business leaders. They want input from all facets of that community to put that strategic plan together. And certainly the Alumni Association is part of that, and the foundation leadership is also a part of that. So they do reach out to people who have different perspectives to put together that strategic plan, because whether it's a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year strategic plan, they do need the input of people who are supporters and stakeholders in that community and with that university.
Great to hear. I know it was beneficial for us, so good to hear that that's happening across the 3 HBCUs as well. I was at Fort Valley, so that was a good session.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question is, what supports are built into the formula for wraparound supports? Example, the 3 public HBCUs in this state receive the largest amount of high school graduates from Title I schools, and students from certain social economic statutes require additional support than others.
Great question. I'll say it 2 ways. So The formula basically is designed to, it first looks at, again, the number of faculty necessary, and then it's kind of these multipliers, if you will, right? About based on that, how many support services are needed. What it doesn't do, and I think I would list this as one of the cons, and that's something that we have to deal with when we talk about our case by case, things that we have to think about and do differently. It doesn't really contemplate, it wasn't, you know, I don't know, back in 1984 when it's put together, you know, if the picture was similar, different, but it doesn't contemplate, you know, that some institutions need more support services, more advisement, more mentoring, more, you know, that personal touch. And so that's something that we really have to address through listening to our institutions, back to those meetings that we have, and then those special case allocations. Again, unfortunately, it's one of the things that the formula does not contemplate.
Okay. This question sounds like the state sticks pretty close to the formula calculations, but the board does not have to follow the allocations based on the formula calculations. In other words, the board is where each member of school may be discriminated against or slighted.
I would say it differently. So if you're asking me, does the board, and this goes back to all the things that we just talked about. If I'll take, you know, I earn $1 this year, right? Because I grew, and you lose $1 this year because your enrollment declined. Straight allocation would say, I take your $1, I earn my $1, we're done, right? But what I have to pay attention to, and it's a balancing act, I have to pay attention to what is taking away that $1 from that institution due to that institution, and what does not rewarding the $1 that has more students, right? What does it do to them? And it's really, and so I like the fact that it's an ask formula and not an allocation formula, because yeah, the math drives the ask, right? We want something concrete, predictable, love that. But the fact that our board has the ability to really to hear from our institutions and address, you know, we just talked about wraparound support services, right? Address things that can't be addressed through this mathematical calculation, I think is a big win. That helps us. And I don't think, you know, being here and being a part of the process, I don't think, I can't remember the word that you used, but I don't see it as a negative. I see it as a big positive that we have that ability to do that.
Okay. What's the impact of constant personnel turnover on the funding formula? Is there a formula for percentage of admin, percentage of faculty, percentage staff, etc., to ensure a sufficient budget?
So again, what actually happens, the formula is really, it's that credit hours, right? And so it's the students that drive the dollars. So it should provide for an adequate number of faculty, staff, et cetera, across our institutions. And we're going to have turnover. We're going to have people who come and go. But that churn, that turnover doesn't impact what we are provided from the state through the formula, because that is based on the number of credit hours or the number of students that we're educating. So they're related. I mean, one provides funding for the other, but if folks are leaving, it doesn't impact the money that we're getting from the state, because we're constantly replacing them.
Okay, thanks. One last question. How do we as HBCUs grow our universities? What are your recommendations?
I would say, I did not go to an HBCU, but I know there is tremendous value in HBCUs. I have lots of friends, and I think, the student experience, and it's really communicating what an HBCU has to offer, not only from an academic perspective. You gotta convince the student, what am I going to get here from an academic perspective, but also, selling the history, that there's so much I'm always jealous when I'm in a room with my friends because I don't have any stories, and they talk about homecoming and all these things that bring students back together once they graduate, and the networking. There's so many cells about, and there's so many great things happening at our HBCUs. I think we could do better telling our story, telling who we are to attract more students. Ask the question again. I got off because I really do get jealous of my friends when they're talking about it. Ask me the question
Tracey,
again.
let me help you out again there also, okay?
Sure, absolutely.
What can we do to increase our universities? Let me just start by saying, number one, you talked about telling the story, the HBCU story. There's a rich history and a rich tradition at each one of these 3 HBCUs, and we've got alums who really serve as ambassadors to tell that story. That's the first thing we've got to do. We've got to tell that story, and we've got to be positive. We can't be negative. I'll be the first to admit, all of our experiences were not positive experience at these HBCUs, but one thing I can say, we may not have gotten the best education that one can get in this country, but we got the best education that those 3 HBCUs could provide. The second thing we need to do, we need to continue to bring in the best and the brightest. And when we bring in the best and the brightest who can compete on an equal level with anybody from whatever institution you want to pit them against, and they can go out and become contributing members of society, that's what brings credit to these institutions. And thirdly, once you have gotten that degree and that education from that institution, and you go out and you make an impact on the world, first and foremost, you got to look back and you got to give back to that institution that provided you that degree, that earned you that living. Most of our alumni do, in some respects, give back, but you got to give until it hurts, your time, your talents, and your treasures. One of the things that hurt our HBCUs when we go out and make the ask among corporations and businesses, one of the first things they ask is, what percentage of your alumni give back to this institution, and how much do they give? And when we cannot stand up and say, our alumni are contributing 100%. They may not contribute as much as some of these bigger institutions alumni can do that, but when they see the record of giving on a consistent basis, it means more to be able to give consistently than in just large numbers, okay? That's what we have to instill in our alumni, and that starts when you are a student at these 3 HBCUs. You've got to build that and drill within them the importance of the education you got there and the importance of giving back. And when you do that, that becomes contagious. It becomes contagious. And that's what we have to do on a consistent basis. Give back to our institutions, because just as somebody helped us, we've got to turn around and help those who are coming after us. I cannot stress enough the importance of giving. I'm the chairman of the foundation at Albany State. And when we look at the numbers, the number of alumni who give and the percentage that give, it's not where it should be, but we're working on those numbers. And that's why I say the most important thing we can do as alumni is give back to these institutions. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, that was the final question.
And that was the final answer. I love it.
Well, Tracey, once again, I certainly do want to thank you on behalf of all our alumni for coming again and giving us this presentation. Hopefully you've answered all the questions that we've had, and you've shed a lot of light on the funding formula by which we get our money at our 3 HBCUs. So again, thank you so much for agreeing to come and share this presentation with us. It really was a treat. And please convey my thanks to the Chancellor when you see him on tomorrow, whenever, for allowing you the time to devote to giving us this presentation.
I'll do it. And thank you for having me. This 2 years in a row, I've enjoyed it both years. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. Ken, do we have any other administrative announcements that we need to make?
No, I think that's it. Other than Savannah State alums, we have our annual meeting this Saturday, May 1st. If you haven't registered already, I think you still have time to register, so please do so.
Okay, Clyde, are you on the line? Luann, are you on the line? Can you unmute Clyde and Luann, Ken?
I'll see if they're on here.
I'm gonna drop off if that's okay with you. Thank
Okay,
you.
Tracy, thanks again. Here.
Okay, take care.
Okay, I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I got Luann here. I'll